George Miller watched in shock as he saw Sister Hope crying desperately in his own restaurant. The 52-year-old nun clutched shredded documents, unaware that the man disguised before her had only 30 days left to live. What she murmured between sobs froze his heart forever. George Miller never imagined that his last 30 days of life would begin amidst the torrential rain lashing the city streets on that somber Tuesday. The 58-year-old man, accustomed to bespoke suits and luxury cars, walked the soaked sidewalks wearing an old jacket and a faded baseball cap, feeling like a stranger in his own world. The diagnosis echoed in his mind like a relentless hammer: terminal cancer, widespread metastasis, no possibility of treatment. The doctors had been direct and cruel in their scientific honesty, making it clear that the culinary empire he had built over 3 decades would be his only tangible legacy. The bitter irony was not lost on George as he pushed open the heavy glass door of his busiest restaurant, the Heritage Table, located in the heart of the downtown business district. For years, he had commanded that culinary empire from his luxurious penthouse, making decisions that affected hundreds of employees without ever setting foot on the floors of the establishments that gave him power and wealth. Now disguised as an ordinary customer, he finally stepped onto the territory he had built but never truly known, carrying with him the overwhelming weight of a death sentence that had transformed each breath into a painful countdown. The welcoming atmosphere of the restaurant contrasted sharply with the storm raging outside and with the even more violent storm unfolding within George's chest. Tables were occupied by happy families, loving couples, and groups of friends laughing loudly, completely unaware that the owner of the place was there, observing them with a mix of envy and melancholy he had never experienced before. Life pulsed vibrantly and warmly around him, while his own existence slipped away like sand through his fingers, leaving him with a void that no amount of money could fill. It was then that George spotted a solitary figure in the most discreet corner of the dining room, a woman dressed in the traditional brown habit of Franciscan nuns, seated before a cup of coffee that must have gone cold long ago. Sister Hope Adams, though he didn't yet know her name, was hunched over the small table, her shoulders trembling with silent sobs that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. Her wrinkled hands, marked by years of hard work and tireless dedication, clutched crumpled papers that she pressed against her chest, as if they were a shipwrecked survivor's last hope, clinging to debris at sea. George felt something strange and unsettling stir in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in decades of calculated business coldness. The sight of that nun crying in his restaurant awakened in him a painful curiosity and a compassion he thought he had buried forever under layers of ambition and material success. For the first time in years, George Miller wasn't thinking about profits, investments, or market strategies, but rather about the raw, human pain emanating from that woman of faith who wept alone amidst the cheerful buzz of the restaurant. Something in the nun's broken posture, in the way she held those documents as if they carried the weight of the world, struck a sensitive chord in his soul that he believed had long been dead. Without fully realizing what he was doing, George chose a nearby table, ordered a simple coffee from the waiter, and began to discreetly observe the scene that seemed straight out of a profound and touching human drama. The nun's sobs were low, but unmistakable, laden with a pain that seemed to transcend any suffering George had ever known, even with the certainty of death knocking at his door. Sister Hope Adams raised her red, swollen eyes from crying so much, revealing a face marked by 52 years of life, dedicated entirely to serving the most needy, but which now reflected a pain so profound it seemed to be tearing her soul apart. George discreetly observed as she unfolded the papers she had been clutching to her chest, revealing official documents with legal stamps that, even from a distance, seemed to carry devastating news. The nun took a deep breath, trying to control the sobs that shook her, and began to read again those words that had clearly utterly devastated her. Tears began to stream down the nun's wrinkled face again as she murmured to herself, in a tone of despair that cut George's heart like a sharp blade. She said she no longer knew what to do, that she had failed everyone who depended on her, that perhaps God had abandoned her in her greatest moment of need. Her broken words echoed an anguish so genuine and devastating that George felt his own suffering, even in the face of imminent death, seem insignificant compared to what that woman of faith was confronting in that terrible moment. George managed to catch fragments of the nun's whispered words, which revealed a tragedy of immense proportions unfolding in her life. She spoke of children who depended on her, of a place that was the only home many people knew, of years of work and dedication that were about to be lost forever. Sister Hope mentioned through tears that she had fought so hard, sacrificed everything she had and more, dedicated every minute of her existence to a noble and just cause, but that now she found herself completely powerless before forces beyond her control and influence. The despair in the nun's voice was palpable, as she repeated several times that she had nowhere to go, that the people who depended on her would be left destitute, that an entire life of service and unconditional love was being destroyed by bureaucratic and financial issues she had never fully understood. George realized that the documents in her hands were eviction notices, legal notifications, and collection letters that painted a clear picture of a charity institution about to be closed due to a lack of financial resources to keep its basic operations running. The situation became clearer and more painful with each word that escaped the nun's trembling lips. Sister Hope ran St. Vincent's Children's Home, which had become a haven for dozens of people abandoned by society, a place where she had dedicated over 20 years of her life, working tirelessly to offer love, care, and hope to those who needed it most. Now, because of accumulated debts and insufficient donations to keep the institution running, she was being forced to close the doors of the only home many children and elderly residents knew, leaving them completely helpless in a cruel and indifferent world. George felt his stomach churn as he realized the magnitude of the suffering he was witnessing. That nun wasn't crying for herself, but for all those who depended on her and who would be lost when the children's home was permanently closed. She carried the weight of dozens of lives on her shoulders, and the fact that she couldn't save them was literally tearing her heart to pieces. The absolute dedication and unconditional love that Sister Hope demonstrated for her charges made George question for the first time in his adult life what the true purpose of his own existence had been, an existence now rapidly approaching its end without him having done anything truly meaningful for another human being. The nun's pain was so intense and genuine that George felt tears well up in his own eyes, something that hadn't happened in decades of calculated emotional coldness and unrestrained ambition. Sister Hope closed her eyes and let her memories take her back to the beginning of her journey of suffering and dedication, recalling how she had reached that point of complete despair that now consumed her entirely. She had been abandoned as a baby on the doorstep of a convent, never knowing the love of a family or the feeling of truly belonging to someone who wanted her unconditionally. The nuns who raised her were kind, but always made it clear that she was a responsibility, a burden they carried out of Christian obligation, never out of genuine love or the desire to have her in their lives as a beloved and desired daughter. She grew up knowing she was different from the other children, that she had no family surname, no stories of special birthdays or cherished family traditions to remember fondly. Sister Hope learned very early on that her life would be dedicated to serving others, for that was how she could justify her existence in a world that had rejected her from day one. When she took her religious vows at 22, she believed she had finally found her true family and divine purpose, but she soon discovered that even within the religious community, she was still seen as a second-class member, a nun without important family connections or financial resources that could benefit the order. The years passed in a painful sequence of rejections and disappointments that profoundly and definitively shaped her character. Sister Hope was transferred from convent to convent whenever a conflict arose or when her presence became inconvenient for superiors who preferred nuns with more prestigious family backgrounds. She accepted each transfer with silent resignation, carrying her few possessions in an old suitcase and leaving to start anew in a new place where she would again be seen as a stranger who needed to prove her worth through hard work and tireless dedication. It was during one of these transfers that Sister Hope arrived at St. Vincent's Children's Home, a decaying and forgotten institution that cared for abandoned children and elderly without families, located in an impoverished neighborhood on the city's outskirts where no one wanted to work. The Mother Superior at the time had sent Hope there as a kind of disguised punishment, hoping she would give up religious life and leave forever. But it was in that rejected and abandoned place that she finally found her true calling and the unconditional love she had sought her entire life. The children and elderly residents of the children's home didn't care about her family-less past or her humble origins. They simply needed someone to love them and care for them with genuine dedication. Sister Hope gave herself completely to that mission, working 18 hours a day, begging for donations, fixing what was broken with her own hands, cooking, cleaning, medicating, hugging, and comforting everyone who needed her maternal attention. She transformed that forgotten place into a true home, where love overcame material difficulties and where each person felt truly loved and valued. For 20 years, Sister Hope had been a mother, nurse, teacher, counselor, and friend to hundreds of people who passed through her life, offering them everything she herself had never received: unconditional love, total acceptance, and the feeling of belonging to a true family. Now at 52, after a lifetime dedicated to society's rejected and abandoned, she found herself once again facing abandonment and rejection, but this time the pain was multiplied by knowing that her fall would drag down dozens of innocents who depended completely on her love and care to survive. George could no longer bear to simply observe that scene of intense human suffering and decided to approach the table where Sister Hope continued to cry silently, holding the papers that represented the destruction of her entire life dedicated to serving others. He stood up slowly, feeling the weight of his own mortality and the pain of others pressing on his chest, and walked toward the nun with hesitant steps, unsure exactly what he would say or how he could offer any kind of solace for a pain as profound and genuine as the one he was witnessing. As George approached the table, Sister Hope raised her red, swollen eyes, revealing an expression of surprise mixed with embarrassment at being seen in such a vulnerable and intimate moment of despair. She quickly tried to wipe away her tears with the sleeves of her habit and apologized for disturbing the restaurant's peace with her sadness, demonstrating even amidst her suffering the kindness and consideration for others that had always characterized her benevolent personality. George sat down at her table without asking permission, moved by an impulse he couldn't fully comprehend himself. With a soft, concerned voice that surprised even himself, George told the nun he had noticed her distress and asked if she needed any help or would like to talk to someone about what was happening. Sister Hope looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and distrust, as she was accustomed to being ignored or rejected by people when she needed support. But there was something in the sincere expression of that unknown man that made her feel he might truly care about her suffering. Between choked sobs, she began to tell her story to the kind stranger who had approached her in her moment of greatest need. George listened in silence, while Sister Hope explained that she had run St. Vincent's Children's Home for over 2 decades, caring for abandoned children and elderly without families who had no other place in the world where they were loved and unconditionally accepted. She recounted how she had dedicated every day of her life to making that place a true home for society's outcasts, working tirelessly to offer not just shelter and food, but primarily love, affection, and the feeling of belonging to a true family that accepted them exactly as they were. With a voice broken by emotion, the nun revealed that the children's home was facing a devastating financial crisis that left her completely powerless and desperate. Donations had decreased drastically in recent years, the maintenance costs of the old building had risen exponentially, and now they owed an enormous sum they couldn't possibly pay. The documents she held were final eviction notices, utility shut-off warnings for electricity and water, and letters from lawyers demanding immediate payment of debts that had accumulated over months of extreme hardship. Sister Hope explained with tears in her eyes that within a week the children's home would be officially closed, and all the people who depended on her would be scattered among different public institutions, separating families that had formed through love, not blood. The younger children would be sent to overcrowded foster care facilities, where they would receive only basic care without personalized affection, while the elderly would be transferred to nursing homes, where they would spend their last days alone and forgotten. The possibility of destroying the only families those people knew was breaking the nun's heart, as she felt responsible for not having found a way to save the place that was the center of her existence and the home of everyone she loved. George felt his own suffering pale before the magnitude of the tragedy, unfolding in the life of that extraordinary woman who had dedicated everything she had to caring for society's abandoned and rejected. Sister Hope took a deep breath and began to reveal to George the most painful part of her personal story, one she rarely told anyone, but now needed to share with the kind stranger who had approached her in her moment of greatest despair. She explained that her own experience of abandonment and rejection had begun much earlier than he could imagine, shaping every aspect of her personality and life choices in a profound and definitive way that still affected her every day of her existence. With a voice choked with emotion, the nun recounted how she had been found as a newborn baby in a cardboard box on the doorstep of the convent of the Sisters of Charity during a cold winter dawn, with no identification or note explaining who her parents were or why they had decided to abandon her in such a cruel and definitive way. The nuns who found her named her Hope because they believed God had placed that child in their lives as a symbol of renewed hope. But the bitter irony was that she herself had spent her entire life searching for hope in a world that constantly rejected her and made her feel unwanted. During her first years of life, Sister Hope had constantly fantasized about her biological parents, creating elaborate stories in her child's mind about how they were wonderful people who had been forced to abandon her due to tragic and temporary circumstances, and that one day they would return to take her to a happy life in a loving and united family. She used to spend hours at the children's home window watching people pass by on the street, wondering if that elegant woman or well-dressed man could be her parents who had finally returned to claim her as their beloved and desired daughter. As the years passed without any sign of her biological parents, Sister Hope began to develop a profound feeling of inadequacy and rejection that would accompany her for the rest of her life, making her always strive harder than others to prove she deserved to be loved and accepted. She became the most obedient child in the children's home, always willing to help with the most difficult tasks, always smiling even when she felt like crying, always putting the needs of others before her own to try and ensure that no one else would abandon her as her parents had done. When she turned 18 and had to leave the children's home to pursue her own life, Sister Hope made the decision to become a nun, not only out of religious vocation, but primarily because she believed that by serving God and the needy, she would finally find the unconditional love and acceptance she had sought throughout her childhood and adolescence. She thought that by dedicating her entire life to others, she would be able to fill the enormous void in her heart, since her parents had rejected her shortly after her birth. However, even within religious life, Sister Hope continued to face rejection and abandonment in subtle but painful ways. The other nuns always treated her as an outsider, someone without a respectable family history or important connections that could benefit the congregation. She was constantly transferred from convent to convent whenever her presence became inconvenient, always having to start over from scratch in new places where she again needed to prove her worth through hard work and extreme dedication. It was only when she arrived at St. Vincent's Children's Home that Sister Hope finally found her true home and purpose, caring for other people who, like her, had been abandoned and rejected by society. Now the possibility of losing that place, which had become her chosen family, was destroying her heart in a way that surpassed even the pain of the original abandonment she had suffered as a baby. George remained silent for several minutes after hearing Sister Hope's devastating story, feeling an overwhelming weight settle in his chest as he processed the magnitude of suffering that extraordinary woman had endured throughout her life, dedicated to serving others. For the first time in decades of calculated emotional coldness, he found himself confronted with a reality that forced him to question every choice he had made during his existence, every priority he had set, every value he had embraced in his relentless pursuit of material success and corporate power. The irony of the situation was not lost on George, as he observed that none who had dedicated her entire life to caring for the abandoned and rejected, offering unconditional love to people society had cast aside, while he himself had spent decades accumulating wealth and building a culinary empire without ever genuinely caring about the well-being of another person. Sister Hope had transformed her own pain of abandonment into compassion for others, while George had allowed his ambition to transform him into someone cold and distant, incapable of forming meaningful human connections or finding purpose in anything beyond profits and material achievements. Sitting before that woman who wept at the possibility of no longer being able to care for the people she loved, George realized that all his wealth and success seemed empty and insignificant compared to the legacy of love and dedication that Sister Hope had built over her 2 decades of tireless work at the children's home. He possessed enough financial resources to solve all the problems that were destroying the nun's life in a matter of minutes, but he had spent years squandering fortunes on unnecessary luxuries, speculative investments, and personal whims that benefited no one but himself. Guilt began to intensely gnaw at George as he realized he had wasted countless opportunities to make a difference in the lives of people who truly needed help, always choosing to prioritize his own interests and insatiable thirst for more power and recognition. While Sister Hope had transformed a decaying children's home into a welcoming haven through love, hard work, and personal sacrifice, he had built a corporate empire that, in the end, had not made the world a better place for anyone but himself. George felt tears well up in his eyes as he imagined all the children and elderly who would be separated and sent to impersonal institutions when the children's home closed, destroying families formed through Sister Hope's unconditional love. The possibility that that extraordinary woman would lose everything she had fought for over 20 years, simply due to a lack of financial resources that he possessed in abundance, forced George to confront the moral vacuity of his own existence in a way that left him deeply shaken and ashamed. For a few moments, George considered simply revealing his identity to Sister Hope and solving all the children's home's financial problems immediately, but something prevented him from taking that impulsive step. He realized he wanted to better understand the situation, to delve deeper into the extent of the nun's work, and to be sure that his help would be truly meaningful and lasting, not just a superficial gesture of charity that would give him a temporary feeling of moral redemption. George also began to question his own motivations, wondering if the desire to help Sister Hope was born from a genuine place of compassion and justice, or if it was merely a desperate attempt to find some meaning and purpose in his last days of life. He didn't want his imminent death to be the sole reason to finally care about another person's suffering, but at the same time, he recognized that perhaps it was necessary to face his own mortality to finally see the importance of living a life dedicated to the well-being of others, as Sister Hope had done throughout her admirable and inspiring existence. Sister Hope wiped her tears with the sleeves of her habit and looked directly into George's eyes, revealing a raw vulnerability that made his heart ache painfully. With a voice broken by the deepest emotion, she began to share the most devastating aspect of the entire tragedy unfolding in her life, something that went far beyond financial matters and directly touched the essence of everything she had fought for over 2 decades of tireless dedication to society's outcasts. The nun explained that what destroyed her most from within was not losing the building or seeing the children's home closed, but rather the absolute certainty that the families she had helped form through unconditional love would be brutally separated and scattered among different overcrowded and impersonal public institutions. She recounted how she had seen orphaned children arrive at the children's home completely traumatized and emotionally broken, and how over the years she had managed to heal them through love, patience, and maternal dedication, transforming them into confident and happy young people who finally knew the meaning of belonging to a true family. With tears streaming freely down her wrinkled face, Sister Hope described how there were elderly individuals abandoned by their own children who arrived at the children's home feeling completely useless and rejected, but who, under her care, had rediscovered their dignity and purpose, becoming loving grandparents to the orphaned children and finding new reasons to smile and feel loved. She had created an environment where generations mixed naturally, where children had dozens of adopted grandparents who showered them with affection, and where the elderly found grandchildren of the heart who gave new meaning to their lives at the end of their earthly journey. The nun revealed to George that many of the older children at the children's home had already become like true children to her, young people she had raised since infancy, and who now, at 15 or 16, were her closest companions in the mission of caring for the younger ones and the elderly. They formed a united team of love and dedication, where each person had an important role and felt truly valued and necessary for the well-being of the entire chosen family that had formed over the years through bonds stronger than blood. Sister Hope recounted that there was a girl named Anna Claire, 17 years old, who had arrived at the children's home at the age of 3, completely traumatized by abuse and neglect, and who was now her right hand in managing the place, a brilliant and compassionate young woman who dreamed of becoming a social worker to help other abandoned children. There was also a 70-year-old man named Joseph, who had arrived at the children's home after being cast out by his ungrateful children, and who had become the most beloved grandfather to all the children, telling wonderful stories and teaching them important values about kindness and perseverance. The prospect that Anna Claire would be sent to a state-run children's home, where she would be just another number among hundreds of troubled teenagers, losing all the emotional structure and dreams she had built, was tearing Sister Hope's heart apart in a way she couldn't bear. The possibility that her Joseph would be sent to an overcrowded nursing home, where he would spend his last years alone and forgotten, after having found new happiness as the loving patriarch of his chosen family, made the nun feel that she was failing the most important people in her life. George realized that Sister Hope's pain was not just the sadness of an administrator losing an institution, but rather the despair of a mother about to have her children taken from her forever, of a daughter who would see her adopted parents scattered to distant places where they could never meet again. That children's home was not just a shelter, but a true home where love had healed deep wounds and created family bonds stronger and more genuine than many biological families managed to develop over decades of coexistence. George felt something fundamental transform within his chest as he listened to Sister Hope describe the extraordinary family that would be destroyed by the lack of financial resources he possessed in abundance. For the first time in his adult life, he experienced absolute moral clarity about what he needed to do, a certainty that transcended any business calculation or personal consideration that normally dominated his decisions. The rapidly approaching death suddenly no longer seemed like a cruel sentence of fate, but rather a unique opportunity to give true meaning to his last days of existence through an act of unconditional love and social justice. Without further hesitation, George looked directly into Sister Hope's red, swollen eyes and asked what the exact total value of the debts threatening to close the children's home was. What amount would be needed not only to clear all outstanding debts, but also to ensure that the institution could operate stably and comfortably for the next few years, without again facing financial crises that would jeopardize the safety and well-being of all those people who depended on the nun's love and dedication to survive and thrive. Sister Hope looked at George with an expression of confusion mixed with timid hope, unable to understand why this unknown man was asking about such specific details of a situation that didn't directly affect him. She explained that the children's home owed approximately $300,000 in overdue bills, pending taxes, and accumulated supplier debts, in addition to needing at least another $450,000 for urgent renovations to the old building and to create a reserve fund that would guarantee the institution's financial stability for the next 5 years, without relying solely on uncertain and irregular donations. George did some quick calculations in his mind and realized that $750,000 represented less than he spent in a single month on his unnecessary personal luxuries, less than the value of one of the luxury cars in his garage, less than he had lost in a single miscalculated stock market play the previous year. The amount that meant the difference between salvation and destruction for dozens of innocent lives was literally insignificant compared to his personal fortune, which made George feel profound shame about the priorities he had set throughout his life of empty material success. Taking a deep breath and feeling an unwavering determination grow in his chest, George told Sister Hope that she no longer needed to worry about financial matters, that the children's home would not be closed, and that all the people who depended on her would remain safe and loved in their true home. The nun looked at him with utter disbelief, unable to process what she was hearing, thinking that perhaps despair was making her hallucinate, or that this kind man was trying to console her with empty words of hope that had no basis in the cruel reality she was facing. George pulled out his cell phone, and before the nun's astonished eyes called his personal lawyer and instructed him to immediately prepare a bank transfer of $750,000 to the account of St. Vincent's Children's Home, explaining that it was an urgent and irreversible donation that needed to be processed the same day to prevent the institution's imminent closure. He also instructed the lawyer to establish an automatic monthly donation of $15,000 that would ensure the children's home's permanent financial stability, allowing Sister Hope to focus completely on caring for her chosen families without ever needing to worry about monetary issues that were beyond her control. Sister Hope began to tremble uncontrollably as she listened to George give those precise and detailed instructions, realizing that this was no joke or illusion, but a real miracle happening before her eyes through the inexplicable kindness of a stranger who had appeared in her life in her moment of absolute greatest despair. Sister Hope collapsed in tears of relief and disbelief when George finished the call and confirmed that the bank transfer was already being processed, ensuring that within a few hours the children's home would be completely free of all the debts that threatened to destroy the family she had spent over 20 years building with unconditional love and tireless dedication. Her hands trembled violently as she held George's arm, trying to find adequate words to express a gratitude so profound it transcended any known human language, an emotion so intense it made her heart race as if it were about to explode with happiness and relief. George looked at that extraordinary woman who had dedicated her entire life to society's outcasts and felt an inner peace he had never experienced before, even knowing that his own death was rapidly approaching. For the first time in decades of existence focused solely on accumulating wealth and power, he had done something truly significant and transformative, something that would continue to generate love and hope long after he was no longer present in the world to witness the fruits of his single truly noble and selfless act. With a voice choked by the most genuine emotion he had ever felt, George explained to Sister Hope that this donation was not condescending charity from a rich person wanting to feel better about himself, but rather a belated recognition that she represented everything he should have been during his life, but never had the courage or wisdom to become. He said that he had spent decades building a material empire that benefited no one but himself, while she had transformed her own pain of abandonment into a source of healing and love for hundreds of people who had no one else in the world willing to care for them with maternal dedication. Sister Hope held George's hands in her own hands, calloused from hard work, and said that God had sent an angel in disguise in her hour of greatest need, that this financial miracle was not just about money, but about the confirmation that her life of sacrifice and dedication had real value and meaning in the divine plan. She explained that there were times when she wondered if she was making a genuine difference in people's lives, or if she was just prolonging inevitable suffering, but that now she knew, with absolute certainty, that her mission was blessed and supported by higher forces operating through human kindness. George felt tears stream down his face as he realized that, by saving Sister Hope's children's home, he had also found his own redemption and given true purpose to his last days of life. The prospect of death, which had tormented him with fear and bitterness for weeks, transformed into serene acceptance, for now he knew that his existence had culminated in something beautiful and lasting that would continue to spread love and hope for future decades. Through the extraordinary work of that admirable nun, the two remained seated at that restaurant table, united by a profound spiritual connection that transcended differences in social class, origin, and life path, sharing a moment of pure grace where unconditional love had conquered selfishness, where compassion had overcome indifference, and where generosity had triumphed over the greed that normally dominated human relationships. George finally understood that true wealth was not in the numbers of his bank account, but in the ability to transform lives through acts of sincere and selfless kindness. Sister Hope told George that he would be eternally remembered in her prayers and in the hearts of all the people whose lives he had saved through that extraordinary gesture of generosity, promising that St. Vincent's Children's Home would forever be dedicated to the memory of that inexplicable kindness that had appeared in her life as a divine miracle in her moment of greatest despair. George revealed to Sister Hope that his generosity had stemmed from a personal situation that had forced him to completely rethink the meaning of his existence, explaining with a serene voice that he had received a terminal diagnosis a few weeks prior and had only a few days left to live. He recounted how that casual encounter in the restaurant had become the most transformative experience of his entire life, showing him that it was still possible to find purpose and redemption even in the last moments of one's earthly journey through acts of unconditional love and social justice, that benefited people truly deserving of support and care. Sister Hope was deeply moved to learn that George was facing his own battle against mortality, but instead of expressing pity or sadness, she looked at him with a mixture of admiration and gratitude that touched his heart unexpectedly. The nun said she now understood even more the magnitude of the sacrifice he had made, for she knew that people in terminal situations often become bitter and focused exclusively on their own fears and needs, but that George had chosen to use his last days to spread love and hope in the lives of dozens of people who would never know him personally. In the following weeks, George visited St. Vincent's Children's Home numerous times, always disguised as a simple volunteer who wanted to help with basic tasks, but in reality, closely observing the extraordinary work done by Sister Hope and her chosen family. He personally witnessed how Anna Claire had blossomed into a confident and compassionate young woman who dedicated her afternoons to teaching the younger children, how Mr. Joseph had become the beloved patriarch who told fascinating stories and offered wise counsel to those who needed guidance, and how dozens of other people found love, dignity, and purpose in that welcoming environment created through 2 decades of tireless dedication. George also used his last days to completely reorganize his will, dedicating the majority of his fortune to create a permanent foundation that would support children's homes, nursing homes, and other charities that cared for people abandoned and rejected by society. He established rigorous criteria to ensure that the resources were directed exclusively to genuine organizations like Sister Hope's Children's Home, which demonstrated true love and personal dedication to the needy, not just impersonal and bureaucratized assistance that treated beneficiaries as statistical numbers. During his regular conversations with Sister Hope, George learned about faith, hope, and unconditional love in a way he had never experienced before, discovering that the proximity of death did not have to be solely a source of fear and bitterness, but could become a catalyst for profound spiritual transformation and meaningful actions that left lasting legacies of kindness in the world. The nun helped him find inner peace and serene acceptance of his mortality, teaching him that a life truly well lived was measured not by its temporal duration, but by the positive impact it could generate in the existence of other people. When George finally departed this life a few weeks later, surrounded by the love and gratitude of Sister Hope and all the people whose lives he had transformed through his redemptive generosity, St. Vincent's Children's Home became a living testament that it is never too late to find true purpose and leave a legacy of love that transcends physical mortality. Sister Hope had a small memorial garden built in his honor, where a simple plaque recalled that a man had discovered in his last days of life what truly mattered in human existence. Years later, Anna Claire graduated in social work with a scholarship from the foundation created by George, dedicating her career to replicating the model of love and care she had received at the Children's Home. Mr. Joseph lived out his last years as the most beloved grandfather to dozens of children who found true family through Sister Hope's work. And the nun herself continued her mission to transform abandonment into love, knowing that her dedication had been blessed by a divine miracle that arrived through human kindness in her moment of greatest need. The story of George Miller and Sister Hope silently spread as an inspiration to all who believe in the possibility of redemption, transformation, and unconditional love, proving that it is never too late to discover the true purpose of life through selfless service to the most needy. The restaurant where it all began became a special symbol for Sister Hope, who returned there every month to silently give thanks for the miracle that had saved her chosen family. She always sat at the same table where she had cried desperately on that stormy night, but now her tears were of profound gratitude for having met a man who transformed his last days of life into an eternal legacy of love and hope. St. Vincent's Children's Home prospered beyond all dreams, becoming a national benchmark in humanized care for abandoned individuals. Anna Claire grew up and founded her own organization, multiplying the love she had received. Mr. Joseph lived surrounded by affection until his last days, departing in peace knowing he was deeply loved. Sister Hope never forgot that God works miracles through human hearts, willing to love unconditionally. Her story proves that even in the darkest hours, kindness can transform despair into hope, abandonment into embrace, and that true love always finds a way to triumph.